The dog had led him 6 miles into the woods, and now, with a child fading beneath the floor, it was gone. Rain hammered the roof of the abandoned ranger station as Staff Sergeant Daniel Brooks lay pinned beneath a fallen support beam, one leg trapped, one hand stretched toward the darkness where Scout had vanished. The old building groaned around him, every board swollen with storm water, every nail complaining under the weight of the wind. Somewhere below the floorboards, a boy coughed once. Weakly, then nothing. Daniel held his breath and listened. "Hey," he called, forcing calm into his voice. "Stay with me down there. Can you hear me?" For a moment, there was only rain, dripping wood, and the thin hiss of cold air slipping through broken windows. Then 3 faint knocks rose from beneath the floor. Tap, tap, tap. Daniel closed his eyes. The child was still alive. Barely. He pressed both palms against the beam and pushed. The wood shifted less than an inch before settling back across his boot. Pain moved through his leg, dull and heavy, but he refused to give it a name. Names made things real. Marines learned that sometimes survival began by narrowing the world to the next breath, the next movement, the next person who still needed you. "All right," he whispered. "One more time." He braced his shoulders against the damp floor and pushed again. Dust drifted from the ceiling. A cracked lantern rolled across the room, its weak flame throwing long shadows against the walls. On the far side of the station, the door Scout had passed through swung open and shut in the wind. Empty. Daniel stared at it. Only seconds earlier, the German shepherd had stood beside him, soaked to the skin, amber eyes fixed on Daniel as if waiting for an order. Daniel had reached for the dog's collar. "Stay." Scout had looked at him once. Then he had turned and disappeared into the storm. No bark. No hesitation. Just gone. Daniel knew dogs. He had trusted one with his life in places where daylight felt borrowed, and every sound carried a question. He knew the difference between panic and purpose. Yet in that moment, trapped in a failing building with a child beneath him, the old doubt returned like cold water filling a room. Maybe he had mistaken desperation for loyalty. Maybe Scout had never been leading him toward rescue. Maybe the dog had only been trying to escape the woods himself. The thought landed harder than the beam. "You left," Daniel murmured, though he did not know whether he meant Scout or someone else. Around his neck, beneath his rain-soaked jacket, 2 worn dog tags rested against his chest. One carried his own name. The other did not belong to a man. Valor. The letters had been scratched thin by years of Daniel rubbing his thumb across them whenever sleep refused to come. He touched the tag now. Cold metal. Old memory. A distant bark buried beneath thunder. Daniel pulled his hand away. Beneath the floor, the child knocked again, slower this time. 2 taps. A pause. One more. "I hear you," Daniel said. "I'm not going anywhere." The promise came easily. Keeping it was another matter. Water had begun to creep across the floor from beneath the rear wall. It slid around Daniel's sleeve and gathered in the cracks between the boards. The station sat in a low hollow between 2 ridges, and the storm had turned every trail into a stream. If the rain continued, the cellar below would fill. Daniel twisted, searching for anything within reach. A rusted shovel leaned against the wall 10 feet away. Too far. A coil of rope hung from a peg near the door. Farther still. His flashlight lay on its side beyond the beam, its light flickering across an old photograph pinned beneath a broken chair. He could see only part of it. A younger man in a Marine uniform. A German shepherd seated beside him. The dog's ears were alert, its posture proud, and around its neck was a collar marked with a small brass plate. Even from across the room, Daniel could make out 2 numbers. 27. His breath caught. Scout's collar carried the same number. K9-27. Daniel had seen it less than an hour earlier beneath the mud and torn leather, just before the floor gave way. At the time, he had told himself it meant nothing. Units reused numbers. Trainers reused equipment. The world was full of coincidences when a man wanted answers badly enough. But the photograph did not feel like coincidence. Neither did the dog. Another groan moved through the building, deeper than before. The roof sagged above him, releasing a cold sheet of rain through a widening gap. Daniel turned his face away and raised one arm against the water. "Come on, Scout," he whispered. "Whatever you're doing, do it fast." No answer came. Only the forest beyond the door, black and restless beneath the storm. Daniel looked toward the floorboards. "What's your name?" he called. Silence. Then a small voice rose from below, no louder than a breath. Noah. Daniel swallowed. Noah, I'm Daniel. The boy coughed. Is the dog there? Daniel looked at the open doorway. The wind carried the scent of wet pine, mud, and something faintly metallic from the old building. He stepped outside, Daniel said. He'll come back. He did not know why he said it with such certainty. Perhaps because children deserved hope. Perhaps because Daniel needed it too. Beneath the beam, his fingers brushed a splintered length of wood. He gripped it and tried to wedge it under the support. The makeshift lever bent, but held. Daniel shifted his weight, pushing down with both hands. The beam lifted slightly. Enough for his trapped boot to move. Not enough to pull free. He pushed harder. The wood creaked. His arms trembled. The lantern flame flickered and nearly died. Then, from somewhere beyond the rain, came a single bark. Sharp. Certain. Close. Daniel froze. Another bark answered from deeper in the woods, followed by the faint clatter of metal dragging over stone. The sound grew louder. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Daniel stared at the doorway as Scout burst through the rain, jaws clenched around the end of a weathered rescue rope. The dog's chest heaved, water streaming from his coat, but his eyes were steady. He crossed the room without hesitation and dropped the rope beside Daniel's hand. For one quiet second, neither moved. Then Scout pressed his nose against Daniel's shoulder. Not an apology, not a plea, a command. Get up. Daniel gripped the rope and looked into the dog's amber eyes. The truth had not yet revealed itself. The child beneath the floor was still running out of time. The storm was still closing in. But one thing had changed. Scout had not abandoned him. He had gone to bring back the only thing that might save them all. Daniel looped the rescue rope around the fallen beam, fed the other end through a rusted iron bracket near the wall, and pulled until the line tightened. Scout seized the loose section in his teeth and leaned backward, paws sliding across the wet boards. Easy, Daniel said. Hold it there. The German shepherd lowered his body and held fast. Daniel pushed against the splintered lever beneath the beam. Wood groaned. The rope stretched. For one breathless second, nothing moved. Then the beam lifted just enough for Daniel to wrench his boot free. He rolled onto his side as the support dropped behind him with a heavy thud. Scout released the rope and pressed close, nose moving quickly over Daniel's jacket, hands, and leg, checking him with the practiced focus of a working dog. Daniel placed a palm against the animal's wet shoulder. I knew you would come back. The words were meant for Scout, but they carried the weight of another name. Beneath the floor, Noah coughed again. Daniel forced himself upright. His ankle protested, but it held. The child mattered more. Scout turned toward the warped cellar door and scratched once, then looked back. Daniel picked up the rope, the lantern, and the broken length of wood. Show me. The dog led him across the tilting room, but before Daniel could reach the door, the world seemed to pause around the small brass number on Scout's collar. 27. The same number in the photograph. The same number Daniel had once seen stamped into a leather training lead years ago. A memory stirred, distant and incomplete, like a voice heard through rain. To understand why that number stopped him cold, and why he had followed a strange dog into a storm without knowing where it led, the story had begun 18 hours earlier, beneath the pale morning lights of a gas station outside Pine Creek. Daniel Brooks had arrived in town shortly after 6 o'clock, driving an old dark green pickup that carried more dust than luggage. The sky was the color of unpolished steel, and a low fog rested between the pine-covered ridges. He had not slept much during the 4-hour drive from Seattle. Sleep rarely came easily near the anniversary. 5 years had passed since Valor died, yet Daniel still measured time by that day. Before it, after it, everything he had failed to become because of it. He parked beside the last fuel pump and shut off the engine. For several seconds, he remained behind the wheel, one hand resting on a small cardboard box in the passenger seat. Inside lay Valor's old training whistle, a folded flag patch, and a photograph Daniel had never found the courage to display. He had come to Pine Creek because a former handler had once told him Valor began his training somewhere in these mountains. Daniel did not expect answers. He only wanted to leave the photograph near the memorial trail, say nothing, and be gone before nightfall. The station's fluorescent lights buzzed above the empty lot. Somewhere behind the building, an ice machine rattled to life. Daniel stepped out, pulled his jacket closed against the cold, and began fueling the truck. That was when he saw the dog. The German Shepherd stood near the tree line, half concealed by fog. He was lean, dark along the back, with sable fur dulled by rain and mud. One ear carried a small tear near the tip. His ribs were not sharply visible, but he had the tired posture of an animal that had traveled too far without rest. He did not approach. He did not bark. He simply watched Daniel with amber eyes that seemed far too steady for a stray. "You lost, buddy?" Daniel asked. The dog's ears moved toward his voice. Then he turned his head toward the woods. Daniel followed the direction of his gaze, but saw only trees and fog. When he looked back, the dog was watching him again. Inside the station, the cashier noticed Daniel staring through the window. She was a woman in her early 60s named Marlene Davis, with silver hair pinned loosely behind her head and the warm, weathered expression of someone who had spent a lifetime recognizing trouble before it spoke. "He has been coming around for 3 mornings," she said as Daniel entered to pay. "Always before sunrise. Never stays after dark. Anybody try to catch him?" Daniel asked. "County Animal Services came yesterday. He disappeared before they reached the lot." Marlene poured coffee into a paper cup and set it near the register. "He does not seem afraid. Just busy." Daniel glanced outside. The dog had moved closer to his truck. Busy doing what? Waiting, maybe. Daniel almost smiled, but the feeling passed before it reached his face. Dogs do not wait without a reason. Marlene studied the dog through the glass. "That is what worries me." Daniel purchased a bottle of water and a package of sliced turkey. Outside, he crouched about 15 feet from the German Shepherd and placed the food on the pavement. "Come on. You look like you could use it." The dog approached slowly, sniffed the turkey, then ignored it. Instead, he lifted his nose toward Daniel's chest. Beneath the jacket, the metal tags shifted softly. The dog took one more step, his eyes fixed on the tag bearing Valor's name. Then, with deliberate care, he sat. Daniel stopped breathing for a moment. It was not the posture of a hungry stray. It was the posture of a trained dog waiting for acknowledgement. "Who taught you that?" Daniel whispered. The shepherd raised one paw and touched Daniel's boot. Then he turned toward the forest. "Walk 3 steps. Look back." Daniel stayed where he was. The dog returned, took the edge of Daniel's sleeve gently between his teeth, and pulled once. No panic. No aggression. A message. Daniel looked toward the dark wall of pines beyond the station. Every instinct told him not to enter unfamiliar woods alone, especially with weather gathering over the ridge. Yet another instinct, older and harder to silence, recognized the truth in the animal's movements. Somewhere out there, something was wrong. Daniel stood, took his flashlight from the truck, and slipped Valor's whistle into his pocket. "All right," he said. "Lead the way." The German Shepherd turned at once, as though he had been waiting for those exact words, and disappeared into the fog. The fog swallowed Daniel before the gas station lights disappeared behind him. Scout moved ahead with silent purpose, weaving between cedar trunks and wet ferns, never so far that Daniel lost sight of the dark line of his back. The forest smelled of rain, bark, and cold earth. Water gathered on pine needles and fell in slow drops that tapped against Daniel's jacket like distant fingers. After the first quarter mile, the ground steepened. Mud pulled at his boots. Roots rose through the trail like old bones, slick beneath a thin skin of moss. Scout climbed without hesitation, then stopped at the top of the rise and looked back. Daniel lifted the flashlight. "I am coming." The dog waited until Daniel reached him, then continued. There was discipline in every movement. No wandering. No wasted motion. Scout was not searching. He already knew where he was going. That truth settled uneasily in Daniel's chest. The path narrowed beside a shallow creek swollen by overnight rain. Scout crossed over a fallen log, balanced with practiced ease, and paused on the far bank. Daniel tested the trunk with one boot. It shifted slightly over the rushing water. You could have chosen an easier road. Scout watched him without sympathy. Daniel almost laughed. Almost. He crossed carefully, arms spread for balance, then dropped onto the opposite bank. The German Shepherd stepped close and sniffed his hand, as if checking his condition before moving on. They had gone nearly a mile when Scout stopped so suddenly that Daniel nearly walked into him. The dog lowered his nose beside a cluster of sword ferns. Daniel followed the beam of his flashlight and saw a child's red glove lying palm up in the mud. It was small enough to fit a boy no older than 10. One finger was torn, and dark soil had been pressed deep into the fabric. Daniel crouched, but did not touch it immediately. The rain had softened the ground around the glove, yet several impressions remained. Small boot prints. A second set, larger and deeper. One of the adult prints dragged at the heel. Scout sniffed the glove once, then turned toward Daniel. The look in his eyes had changed. The patience was gone. A child, Daniel said quietly. Scout moved toward the trees. Daniel took a clean handkerchief from his pocket, wrapped the glove, and placed it inside his jacket. Go. The dog broke into a faster pace. Daniel followed, branches brushing his shoulders as the forest closed around them. The trail disappeared entirely. What remained was a line of disturbed leaves, a snapped twig, a faint mark in the moss. Scout read the ground as if it were a page. Every few minutes, he stopped and raised his head, testing the wind. Then he chose a direction without doubt. Daniel recognized the pattern. Valor had done the same thing during search drills, nose low when scent clung to the earth, head raised when it traveled on the air. The memory came with unexpected clarity. Valor standing in desert dust, ears forward, waiting for Daniel's hand signal. Daniel pushed it away. This was not Valor. Scout was leaner, darker, older around the eyes. Yet the resemblance lived in the silence between commands. Near the base of a granite slope, Daniel found the next sign. A strip of green cloth had been tied around a low branch. Not caught, tied. The knot was tight and simple, the kind used to mark a route without wasting time. Daniel touched the wet fabric. It came from a field jacket or work shirt. Someone ahead understood how to leave a trail. Whoever came through here wanted to be found, he said. Scout looked uphill. Daniel aimed the flashlight higher. 3 long scratches marked the trunk of a Douglas fir. They were too evenly spaced to be random. Scout approached the tree and placed one paw beneath them. Daniel studied the marks. A trained dog could have made them, but only if taught where and when. You did this. Scout turned away before Daniel finished speaking. The climb grew steeper. Wind moved through the canopy with a low, steady sound, and the first cold drops of a new storm began to fall. Daniel checked his phone. No signal. The time read 7:43 in the morning. He had been in the woods less than 2 hours, but the gray light made it feel closer to evening. Scout reached a narrow ledge where the trees opened onto a ravine. Far below, water ran white between dark rocks. The dog paced once along the edge, then found a descending trail no wider than a deer track. Daniel saw a smear of reddish-brown on a stone beside it. He knelt and touched the edge with 2 fingers. Dry at the center, washed thin around it by rain. He did not need training to understand what it was. Scout's front paws carried the same faded color. Daniel looked at the dog more carefully. There were no cuts beneath the mud. The stains did not belong to him. You found someone hurt. Scout's ears rose. Daniel stood, the red glove heavy inside his jacket. A child. An injured adult. A trained German shepherd moving between them and the road. The pieces were beginning to form, but one question remained. Why had Scout waited 3 days before choosing Daniel? The answer came when the wind shifted. From somewhere beyond the ravine, faint but unmistakable, came the hollow clang of metal. Once, then silence. Scout stared into the trees and gave a low sound from deep in his chest. Not fear. Urgency. Daniel reached beneath his jacket and closed his hand around Valor's whistle. He did not use it. Not yet. Instead, he stepped onto the narrow trail and followed Scout down toward whatever was waiting below. The trail descended in tight switchbacks, slick with rain and scattered pine needles. Daniel moved carefully, one hand against the rock wall, the other holding the flashlight low so the beam would catch the shape of the ground before his boots found it. Scout stayed several yards ahead, pausing whenever the distance between them grew too wide. The metallic sound came again from below, a dull strike, followed by a long trembling echo through the ravine. Daniel stopped and listened. It was not natural, not stone against stone. Something man-made was moving in the wind. Scout lifted his nose, then continued downward. At the bottom of the slope, the forest changed. The tall firs gave way to alder and cedar, their branches woven so tightly that morning light barely reached the ground. The air smelled colder there, rich with wet leaves and running water. Daniel stepped over a shallow wash and found a brass flare casing half buried in the mud. He picked it up by the edge. The metal was tarnished, but not old. A faint chemical scent still clung to it. Someone had fired a signal flare recently. Daniel scanned the canopy, but the trees were too dense for any light to have been seen from the road. Wrong place to call for help, he murmured. Scout stood beside a fallen cedar, staring at something beyond it. Daniel moved closer. 3 strips of green cloth had been tied along the branches, each one pointing east. The same careful knot, the same intention, yet Scout was facing north. Daniel followed the dog's gaze and noticed shallow claw marks in the mud, leading away from the cloth markers. They belonged to Scout. The child's boot prints and the dragging adult steps followed the green markers. The dog's tracks did not. For the first time, Daniel saw 2 separate journeys written across the forest floor. Someone had taken Noah east. Scout had gone north, then returned, perhaps more than once. You were moving between them, Daniel said. Scout's ears shifted toward him, but the dog kept watching the trees. Daniel imagined the distance, the cold, the hunger. 3 days of running from one place to another, carrying no message except the one in his eyes. The thought changed the way Daniel saw the animal's thin frame. Scout had not been wandering. He had been working until his body had almost nothing left to give. They continued north. The rain strengthened, ticking against the leaves and darkening the shoulders of Daniel's jacket. 10 minutes later, the ground flattened into what had once been a logging road. Grass grew through the center, and young saplings leaned over the ruts, but tire tracks were still visible beneath the mud. One set entered from the west. None returned. Scout crossed the road and stopped beside a splintered wooden post. A faded Forest Service sign lay face down nearby. Daniel lifted it enough to read the weathered lettering. Service Road 7. Closed beyond this point. Beyond the sign, the road divided. The eastern branch curved downhill, where something metallic flashed between the trees. The northern branch narrowed into a dark corridor of cedar, nearly swallowed by brush. Scout chose the northern path immediately. Daniel remained still. Through the rain, the shape below became clearer. A vehicle, dark green, one rear door open. The intermittent clang came from a loose panel tapping against the body in the wind. Daniel's pulse quickened. A vehicle meant shelter, a radio, identification, perhaps answers. Scout had already gone 15 feet into the northern trail. He turned and looked back. Hold on, Daniel said. He moved toward the downhill branch. Scout returned at once and stepped in front of him. Daniel shifted left. The dog blocked him again. There was no growl, no bared teeth, only quiet resistance. There is a truck down there. Scout glanced toward the vehicle, then back toward the dark trail. He knew it was there. That realization made Daniel uneasy. You want me to ignore it? The German shepherd lowered his head, took one step north, and waited. Daniel looked between the 2 paths. The green cloth markers pointed east, toward the vehicle. Scout's claw marks led north. One trail had been left by a person trying to be found. The other had been made by a dog trying to reach something no one else knew existed. Daniel thought of the red glove inside his jacket. He thought of the blood on the stones and the fading knocks that had not yet happened but seemed, somehow, already waiting for him deeper in the woods. Then his phone vibrated unexpectedly. One weak bar appeared. Daniel called the Pine Creek Sheriff's Office. A dispatcher answered through bursts of static. He gave his name, location, and what he had found. There may be a missing child, he said. I have a red glove, 2 sets of tracks, and a Forest Service vehicle on Service Road 7. The dispatcher's voice sharpened. Do not go farther. Search teams have been looking for Noah Parker since yesterday morning. Sheriff Bennett is less than 12 miles from your location. Daniel looked at Scout. The dog stood beneath the cedar branches, rain running from his muzzle. There is also an injured adult, Daniel said. I cannot confirm where. Stay with the vehicle if you can reach it safely. It will give the team a fixed point. The signal broke apart. Daniel lowered the phone. The instruction was reasonable. The vehicle was visible. The road offered the best chance of meeting rescuers. Scout's path offered nothing but shadow. Daniel took one step downhill. Scout did not follow. He simply sat at the entrance of the northern trail, watching Daniel with an expression that felt less like disobedience than disappointment. Daniel's hand moved to Valor's whistle in his pocket. Trust was easy when the path made sense. The harder kind began where certainty ended. Still, training pulled him toward the truck. I need to know who we are looking for, he told Scout. Then we go your way. The dog remained motionless. Daniel turned downhill alone, unaware that the vehicle would give him an answer, but not the truth. Daniel reached the vehicle in less than 2 minutes, though the downhill mud made every step feel uncertain. It was an older Forest Service utility truck, dark green beneath a film of rain and pine dust, its front bumper pressed against a cedar trunk. The impact had not crushed the cab, but the right front tire sat twisted in a shallow ditch. One rear door hung open, swinging just enough for the loose metal panel to strike the frame whenever the wind rose. Clang. Pause. Clang. The sound that had carried through the ravine. Daniel approached from the driver's side, calling out before he touched anything. United States Marine. Is anyone here? The woods answered with rain. He opened the front door carefully. The seat was damp from the broken window. A brown stain marked the edge of the fabric, and a first aid kit lay open on the floor with several bandages missing. The keys were gone. So was the radio handset. Daniel leaned inside and found a Forest Service identification card wedged near the center console. Walter Hayes, 68 years old, volunteer search coordinator. The photograph showed a broad-faced man with gray hair, steady eyes, and the calm expression of someone who had spent decades outdoors. Beneath the card was a folded topographic map covered in pencil marks. A red circle had been drawn around an old fire lookout north of the road. Beside it, 2 words had been written in block letters. Noah alive. Daniel read the words twice. Relief should have come first. Instead, unease settled deeper. The message was clear, but the map was too clean. No mud. No water damage. Whoever wrote it had been inside the truck after the crash and had expected someone to. Search the cab. Daniel unfolded the map farther. A route had been marked from the vehicle toward the east, matching the green cloth strips in the forest. It ended at a ranger supply shed near a seasonal creek. The fire lookout lay in the opposite direction, nearly 4 miles north, exactly where Scout had tried to lead him. 2 destinations. 2 trails. 1 message. Daniel looked back up the slope. Scout was no longer sitting at the fork. The dog had disappeared. Scout. Daniel's voice carried farther than he intended. No answer. He stepped away from the truck and scanned the road. Rain softened every outline. For a moment, he saw nothing but gray trunks and moving branches. Then the German shepherd emerged from the northern trail at a run, crossed the logging road, and stopped several feet from Daniel. Something red hung from his mouth. The child's glove. Daniel's hand moved instinctively to his jacket. The glove he had wrapped and stored there was gone. Scout must have taken it while Daniel studied the truck, carried it back toward the northern trail, and returned with it. The dog placed the glove at Daniel's feet, then looked north. You are not letting this go. Scout turned and walked several steps away. Daniel crouched beside the glove. One side was wet with fresh rain. The other carried a faint smear of dark soil that had not been there before, finer and grayer than the mud near the road. Soil from higher ground. From the lookout ridge. Scout had used the glove to confirm the child's scent trail, and the trail did not lead east. Daniel felt the shape of the problem click into place. Walter had left a false route on purpose. Not to mislead rescuers, but to divide the search. The east path led to something useful, perhaps supplies or a radio. The north path led to Noah. If Walter was injured, he may have sent Scout toward the road while he tried to move the boy farther uphill, away from flooding. The truck was not the destination. It was the last place Walter had enough strength to leave instructions. Daniel reached for his phone. The single bar had vanished. He tried the emergency number anyway. Nothing. Rain struck harder against the roof of the truck. Water began running along the tire ruts, turning the old road into 2 narrow streams. Scout paced once, then stopped. His body was angled north, but his eyes remained on Daniel. Waiting. Daniel looked at the map again. The direct route to the fire lookout crossed a creek that could rise quickly in a storm. The safer route added nearly 2 miles. Walter had circled the lookout, but the penciled line stopped halfway there. Daniel understood what that meant. Walter had not reached it. He had changed direction, or he had lost the ability to continue marking the map. Daniel took the first aid kit from the floor, added the dry bandages to his pack, and removed a coil of rescue rope from the rear compartment. A reflective emergency blanket, 2 bottles of water, a flashlight, and a hand crank radio followed. He left a note on the dashboard for Sheriff Bennett with the direction, time, and number of people believed missing. Then he returned to the fork. Scout stood beneath the cedar branches exactly where Daniel had left him before going to the truck. The dog's patience had thinned, but not his trust. Daniel knelt and fastened the rope across his shoulder. "You were right." Scout stepped closer. Daniel picked up the red glove and held it near the dog's nose. "Fine, Noah." The change was immediate. Scout lowered his head, inhaled once, and moved north with renewed urgency. Daniel followed. The path narrowed until it was barely visible beneath salal and fern. The storm darkened the sky, though it was not yet noon. After several hundred yards, Scout stopped beside a boulder and stared into a shallow depression filled with wet leaves. Daniel brushed them aside and found a small metal nameplate. Canine Scout. Beneath the name was the same number stamped on the collar. 27. The plate had been bent at one corner, as if torn away in a hurry. Daniel turned it over. Scratched into the back were 3 initials. Walter Hayes. Daniel closed his fingers around the tag and looked at the dog. Scout had not been abandoned. He belonged to Walter. Whatever had happened in these woods, it had separated a trained dog from the man he was trying to save. Then a sound moved through the trees ahead. Not the metallic clang from the truck. Not thunder. A child coughing. Faint, distant, and real. Scout raised his head and ran. Daniel followed him into the dark. Scout vanished between the trees with Daniel only a few strides behind. The red glove tucked safely inside Daniel's jacket and the metal nameplate clenched in his palm. The coughing came again, softer now, carried strangely by the wind. It seemed close, then far away, as if the forest itself were shifting the sound from one ridge to another. Daniel followed the dog through a stand of young firs where the ground rose sharply beneath wet needles. Branches caught at his sleeves. Mud slid beneath his boots. Scout never slowed. He climbed with his nose low, then lifted his head whenever the wind moved downhill. After nearly half a mile, the trees opened around a narrow clearing. At its center stood an abandoned ranger station, gray with age and rain, its roof sagging beneath moss and fallen branches. One window was broken. The porch leaned toward the earth. A rusted weather vane turned above the chimney with a thin, uneven squeal. Scout stopped at the foot of the steps. Daniel listened. The coughing was gone. "Noah," he called. His voice crossed the clearing and disappeared into the woods. No answer. Scout climbed onto the porch and scratched once at the swollen front door. Daniel tested the handle. Locked. The dog moved to the side of the building, where a section of lattice had collapsed, then pressed his nose against a gap beneath the wall. A faint current of warmer air moved through it. Daniel crouched. Someone is inside. Scout looked toward the door. Daniel stepped back, raised one boot, and struck beside the latch. The old frame gave way with a dry crack, and the door swung inward. The station smelled of damp wood, cold ashes, and old paper. Rain tapped through holes in the roof. A lantern sat on the table beside an empty cup. 2 wool blankets had been spread near the stove, and one still held the shallow shape of a small body. Daniel touched it. Barely warm. They were here. Scout crossed the room and sniffed the floorboards, moving in tight circles. Daniel searched quickly. "Hey!" Backpack rested beside the wall. Inside, he found a child's blue rain jacket, a half-empty bottle of water, and a small plastic dinosaur with one wheel missing. Noah's belongings. Near the stove lay a folded field jacket with the name Hayes stitched above the pocket. Daniel picked it up, and something slipped from inside, landing face down on the floor. A photograph. He lifted it carefully. Walter Hayes stood outside a marine training kennel, younger by perhaps 20 years, wearing utility fatigues and holding the lead of a proud sable German shepherd. Beside him stood another Marine, his face partly faded by sunlight. Daniel turned the photograph toward the window. The dog was not Scout. The muzzle was broader, the coat lighter, but the brass plate on the collar carried the same number. 27. Daniel's breath caught. He knew that posture. He knew the narrow white mark beneath the dog's chin. Valor. The animal in the photograph was Valor before Daniel had ever met him. On the back, written in blue ink, were 4 words. First day with Valor. Daniel stared until the room seemed to grow quieter around him. Walter Hayes had trained Valor. The man somewhere in these woods knew the beginning of a story Daniel had spent 5 years trying to understand. Scout gave a sudden low whine. Daniel turned. The dog stood over a section of floor near the rear wall, ears rigid, eyes fixed downward. "Noah," Daniel called again. A faint tapping answered from beneath them. 3 knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. Daniel dropped to one knee and pressed his ear against the boards. "Noah, can you hear me?" A child's voice rose through the floor, thin and uncertain. "Scout." The dog lowered himself and pushed his nose against the crack. His tail moved once. "Scout is here," Daniel said. "My name is Daniel. I am going to get you out." Another voice came from below, older and weaker. "The cellar door." Daniel searched the room until he found a square hatch near the back wall. A warped cabinet had fallen across it. He and Scout moved together, Daniel lifting one side while the dog pushed his shoulder beneath the other. The cabinet slid several inches, revealing an iron ring set into the floor. Daniel pulled. The hatch did not move. The frame had swollen shut. "Stand back." Scout retreated. Daniel wedged the broken chair leg beneath the edge and pushed down. The wood groaned. Dust fell from the ceiling. The hatch lifted less than an inch, then settled. Beneath it, Walter called, "Careful. The floor is weak." As if answering him, a deep crack moved across the room. Daniel froze. A dark line opened between the boards near his boots. Scout barked once. The rear support beam shifted overhead, releasing a shower of dust and rainwater. Daniel stepped back, but the floor tilted beneath him. He reached for the table. It slid away. The beam dropped across the room with a heavy force, pinning Daniel's boot and knocking the lantern onto its side. Scout rushed to him, circling once, searching for a way close. "I am all right," Daniel said through a tight breath. "Stay." The German shepherd stood still, rain dripping from his coat through the broken roof. Daniel pushed against the beam. It did not move. Below, Noah began to cough again. The sound was weaker than before. Daniel looked at Scout and pointed toward the door. "Find help." The dog did not move. "Go." Scout's eyes held his for one long second. Then he turned and disappeared into the storm, leaving Daniel beneath the failing roof with a child below the floor and the photograph of Valor lying just beyond his reach. Daniel heard Scout before he saw him. A sharp bark cut through the rain, followed by the scrape of something heavy dragging across the porch. The German shepherd burst through the doorway with a weathered rescue rope clenched between his teeth. Water streamed from his coat. Mud covered his legs. Yet his eyes were clear and fixed on Daniel. Scout crossed the room and dropped the rope beside Daniel's hand. Then he pressed his nose beneath the fallen beam, searching for the point where it could lift. "You found the truck," Daniel whispered. Scout looked toward the rope. Daniel understood. The dog had not gone for help from a person. He had gone for the tool Daniel needed to free himself. Daniel looped one end of the rope around the beam and pulled it through the iron bracket set into the wall. The bracket groaned when the line tightened, but it held. He wrapped the loose end around his forearms and looked at Scout. "Take it." The dog seized the rope and leaned backward. His paws slipped once across the wet boards, then found purchase. Daniel pushed against the splintered chair leg beneath the beam. "Now." Scout pulled. Daniel pushed. The beam rose less than an inch. It was enough. Daniel twisted his boot free and rolled away as the wood settled back onto the floor. For a moment, he remained still, breathing hard, one hand resting against Scout's shoulder. The dog stood over him, checking his face, his hands, and the leg that had been trapped. "You came back," Daniel said. Scout's ears moved forward. Beneath the floor, Noah coughed. The sound was weaker now. Daniel forced himself upright. His ankle ached, but it carried his weight. He gathered the rope, crossed to the cellar hatch, and threaded the line through the iron ring. The hatch had swollen tight inside its frame. He braced one boot against the floor and pulled. Scout took the rope beside him. Together they strained until the wood gave with a long, reluctant creak. Cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of wet stone, dust, and an extinguished fire. Daniel lifted the hatch far enough to wedge the broken chair leg beneath it. A narrow stairway disappeared into darkness. "Noah, I am coming down." Scout entered first. Daniel followed with the flashlight held low. The cellar was small, no more than 12 feet across, with stone walls and a dirt floor. Rainwater had begun seeping through one corner. Noah lay wrapped in 2 wool blankets near an overturned storage shelf. He was pale from cold, but his eyes opened when Scout approached. The dog curled around him at once, pressing his body close. Noah lifted one hand and rested it against Scout's neck. "I knew he would find somebody," the boy whispered. Beside him sat Walter Hayes, his back against the wall and one leg secured beneath a makeshift wooden brace. His face was tired, his gray hair damp with sweat, but his gaze remained steady. Daniel knelt and opened the first aid kit. Daniel Brooks, former Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. Walter's eyes moved to the dog tags beneath Daniel's jacket. Something changed in his expression. Recognition, followed by a sadness too old to be surprise. "Brooks," he said softly. Daniel unfolded the emergency blanket and wrapped it around Noah. "You know me?" Walter looked toward Scout. "I know the dog you used to have." The words struck Daniel, but there was no time to follow them. Noah's hands were cold, and the water along the cellar wall was rising. Daniel gave the boy small sips of water, then checked Walter's condition without moving the brace. "Can you stand if I support you?" "Not far." Walter glanced at the hatch above them. "The back trail is washed out. The boy cannot make that climb." Daniel looked around the cellar. An old ventilation shaft ran through the north wall, wide enough to carry sound, but not a person. He pulled the hand crank radio from his pack and tried every emergency frequency. Static answered. Scout lifted his head suddenly. His ears turned toward the ceiling. Then came a faint noise beyond the storm. A whistle. 2 short blasts. A pause. 2 more. Search team signal. Daniel climbed the stairs and reached the doorway. Through the trees, barely visible in the rain, a beam of white light moved across the clearing. Sheriff Laura Bennett's voice carried from the ridge. "Daniel Brooks, call out." Daniel raised Valor's whistle to his lips and answered with 3 clear notes. Scout barked once beside him. Minutes later, Laura entered the station with 2 rescue volunteers carrying medical packs and a folding stretcher. They moved Noah first, keeping him wrapped while Scout walked close enough for the boy to touch his fur. Walter was lifted carefully after him. As the volunteers prepared to leave, Walter reached beneath his shirt and removed a small brass whistle hanging from a cord. The metal was worn smooth by years of use. One name had been engraved along its side. Valor. He placed it in Daniel's palm. "I trained him before he became yours," Walter said. "And there is something about his last mission you were never told." Daniel looked down at the whistle, then at Scout standing guard beside Noah. The forest had given him the people he came to save. Now it was about to return a truth he had buried for 5 years. The rescue team moved slowly through the rain, carrying Noah and Walter along the narrow trail, while Scout stayed between the 2 stretchers as if guarding both at once. Daniel walked beside Walter, one hand holding the brass whistle, the other steadying the rope line across the steepest ground. The storm had begun to weaken. Water still fell from the branches, but the wind no longer bent the trees. Gray daylight filtered through the forest in thin, quiet bands. Noah remained wrapped in blankets, his small hand resting near the edge of the stretcher. Every few minutes, Scout stepped close enough for the boy to touch the fur along his neck. Each time, Noah's breathing seemed to settle. Sheriff Laura Bennett led the group towards Service Road 7, where an ambulance waited beyond the washed-out section. No one spoke unless necessary. The forest had taken enough from their voices. After nearly a mile, Walter looked toward Daniel. "Scout did not leave me," he said. Daniel glanced at the German shepherd. "I know." Walter shook his head. "No. You know he came back. That is not the same thing." He paused to gather his breath. When the truck went off the road, Noah was already cold and frightened. "I could not use the radio, and I knew the creek would rise before a search team reached us. I gave Scout the glove and sent him toward the highway." Daniel looked at the red fabric inside his jacket. "He waited 3 days. He returned every night." Walter's voice softened. He brought water in an old canteen pouch. He lay beside Noah until the boy stopped shaking. Then, before sunrise, he went back to the road again. Scout turned his head at the sound of Walter's voice, then continued walking. "Why did he choose me?" Daniel asked. Walter's eyes moved to the dog tags at Daniel's chest. "Because he smelled valor." Daniel said nothing. The path narrowed between 2 wet boulders. The volunteers adjusted the stretcher and moved carefully through. Walter waited until they were clear before speaking again. Scout trained beside Valor when he was young. Different years. Same kennel. Same number. Daniel opened his hand and looked at the whistle. The engraved name was worn, but still visible beneath the rain. "You trained Valor from the beginning?" "From 8 weeks old." A faint smile touched Walter's tired face. "He was stubborn. Too smart for easy praise. He would ignore 3 perfect commands if he believed a 4th choice would protect someone better. Daniel felt the old pressure return beneath his ribs. That sounds like him. It does. They walked several yards in silence. The ambulance siren was faint now, somewhere beyond the trees. Daniel rubbed his thumb across the whistle. You said there was something I was never told. Walter's expression changed. The smile disappeared, leaving only honesty. The final report said Valor became separated from your unit. That is what I was given. It was incomplete. Daniel's steps slowed. Why? Because the full report would have raised questions no one wanted to answer at the time. It was easier to call it confusion. Easier to say the dog lost direction. Walter looked directly at him. He did not. Rainwater slid from the brim of Daniel's jacket. Then what happened? Walter spoke without drama, and that made the words heavier. Valor received the recall signal. He heard it. He turned toward the extraction point. Then he noticed you had not moved. Daniel's hand tightened around the whistle. I was told he could not find me. He found you first. Walter's voice remained calm. He returned because you were still there. Not because you failed to call him. Not because he was lost. He made a choice. Daniel stared ahead at Scout, who walked beneath the pale morning light with his ears raised. For 5 years, Daniel had carried one memory like a sentence. Valor disappearing into smoke. Daniel being pulled away. The empty space where the dog should have been. He had believed survival was evidence of betrayal. His own. Now Walter's words opened another possibility, one Daniel had never allowed himself to see. Valor had not been abandoned. Valor had stayed. Why did no one tell me? Daniel asked. Walter looked toward the wet ground. I tried. By the time I found your contact information, you had left the service. Letters came back. Calls went unanswered. Then I heard you wanted no connection to the unit. Daniel closed his eyes for one step. I thought I had no right. Walter watched him quietly. Dogs do not measure love by what a man thinks he deserves. Ahead, Scout stopped beside Noah's stretcher. The boy's hand had slipped beneath the blanket. Scout nudged it gently until Noah's fingers found his fur again. The small movement said more than Walter could have. Daniel opened his hand and lifted the whistle to the light. Valor had chosen him. Scout had chosen Walter. Then Scout had chosen Daniel because the scent of one loyal soul still clung to the metal over his heart. The truth did not erase grief. It changed its shape. What had felt like failure became sacrifice. What had felt like punishment became a gift he had been too wounded to receive. When they reached the logging road, the ambulance crew hurried forward. Noah was taken first. Walter followed. Scout remained between them until a medic finally closed the doors. Daniel stood beneath the clearing sky, holding the whistle as sunlight touched the wet brass. Scout came to his side and sat. Daniel rested one hand on the dog's head. He knew, did he not? Walter called from inside the ambulance. Daniel looked up. Walter nodded toward Scout. He knew you were the one. Daniel looked down into the German shepherd's amber eyes. For the first time in 5 years, the memory of valor did not end with silence. It ended with a choice. Daniel raised the whistle and gave one soft note. Scout stood at once. 3 months later, the first snow settled over Pine Creek in a thin white veil, softening the roofs, the roads, and the dark shoulders of the surrounding mountains. Daniel stood outside Walter Hayes's small cabin at the edge of town, watching Scout move through the yard with a steadiness that had returned little by little. The German shepherd had gained weight. His sable coat shone again beneath the pale winter sun, and the old tear in his ear seemed less like a wound now than a mark left by a life that had asked much of him. Walter stepped onto the porch with a cane in one hand and a leather folder beneath the other arm. His leg was healing, though more slowly than he liked. Noah had already returned home to his mother and younger sister. He still called every Sunday, always asking first about Scout, then about everyone else. He is ready, Walter said. Daniel looked toward the dog. For another search? Walter shook his head. For a new handler. The words settled between them. Scout stopped near the fence and turned as if he had heard. Daniel's hand moved toward the brass whistle beneath his jacket. He had carried it every day since the rescue, not as a memorial, but as a reminder that loyalty was not meant to become a grave a man lived inside. Walter held out the folder. Inside were Scout's training records, veterinary reports, and transfer papers. Daniel read the first page, then looked up. You are giving him to me? I am asking him to choose. Walter opened the porch gate. Scout remained in the yard, watching both men. Walter lifted 2 fingers in a familiar signal. Free. The dog walked forward slowly. He went first to Walter, pressed his head against the older man's hand, and stood there for several quiet seconds. Walter closed his eyes and rested his palm between Scout's ears. No command followed. No farewell was spoken. Scout stepped away, crossed the frozen ground, and stopped in front of Daniel. Then he sat. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been held too tightly for too many years. He crouched and placed both hands along Scout's neck. You are sure? The dog raised one paw and touched Daniel's knee. Walter gave a low laugh from the porch. He has never been subtle. By spring, Daniel and Scout had completed certification with the Pine Creek Volunteer Search and Rescue Unit. Daniel learned to read the slight changes in Scout's breathing, the angle of his ears, the way his tail held still when a scent became certain. Scout learned Daniel's silences, when to wait beside him and when to pull him forward. They were not replacements for anyone. Daniel understood that now. A bond did not erase the one that came before it. It made room beside it. On a cold morning in late April, a call came before sunrise. An elderly hiker had failed to return from a trail near the northern ridge. Rain had fallen overnight, and fog covered the valley in a low gray sheet. Daniel arrived at the staging area wearing a green search jacket with Scout's lead wrapped around one hand. Families gathered near the command truck, their faces pale with worry, their hope resting on people they had never met. Sheriff Laura Bennett handed Daniel a knit cap sealed inside a paper bag. Last worn yesterday, she said. Trail camera caught him heading towards Cedar Pass around 4 in the afternoon. Daniel nodded and knelt beside Scout. The dog smelled the cap once, then lifted his head toward the trees. Beyond the trailhead, the forest waited beneath the fog, dark and quiet, the same way it had waited months earlier when Daniel first followed a dog he did not know. For a moment, memory returned. The gas station lights, the red glove, rain on broken windows, Valor's name beneath his fingers. But the memory no longer pulled him backward. It stood beside him. Daniel removed the brass whistle and gave one clear note. Scout's ears rose. Find him. The German shepherd stepped onto the trail, then paused and looked back. Not because he doubted the way, because partners did not leave one another behind. Daniel tightened his pack and followed. The path climbed between wet cedars, and morning light slowly entered the fog. Behind them, the worried family watched until both man and dog disappeared among the trees. Hours later, they would return with the missing hiker walking carefully between 2 rescuers, cold and tired, but alive. Scout would sit beside the ambulance while Daniel gave him water from his own canteen. Walter would hear the news over the radio and smile alone at his kitchen table. Noah would send Daniel a drawing of Scout wearing a red rescue vest, standing beneath a bright yellow sun. Yet none of them would ever know the exact moment Daniel finally forgave himself. It happened quietly on that trail, long before they found the hiker, when Scout stopped beneath a break in the trees and sunlight touched the number on his collar. 27. Daniel rested one hand on the dog's back and looked toward the ridge ahead. Valor had led him through one darkness. Scout had led him through another. Some loyal souls find the lost in forests. Others find the places inside us that have been waiting years to come home.